I wonder if you can take us back to the moment that you started telling people that your next book was going to have a big section on Palestine and Israel, and what some of those conversations were like. I'm wondering if people close to you had real fears.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's only appropriate that I take this back to our conversations, which literally go back years, and you telling me, wow, you have to go, you have to go. I feel like every time I saw you, you were like, you have to go. And did people have fears for me taking this on? Yes, but I think also there was a sense that it was the right thing to do. Oddly enough, I think maybe the fears that a lot of people think of were not ones that were manifested really in my life or that people really cared about, i.e., people's perception of me. In certain quarters, I have had the luxury of my private life being pretty separate from my public life. It's not that I don't have some work friends. I do, or some people from work that I care about very much. I do. But in my private life, I'm actually not that important. My status as a writer is really kind of irrelevant. It doesn't get me much, among my friends and family. Like I wasn't going to lose them. So what did it really matter? And it's quite clear, I think the past couple of weeks have demonstrated the reaction people have when you just tell them what you saw or what you've read. That yes, there is a lot of pressure put on so that certain stories are not heard. But, I don't know what was the point of getting this far in my career as a writer. Like if, you're gonna not touch the sensitive things. Like what's the point? Why are we doing this?
One of the things that I've always wondered about is, if you look at the American media, you look at a panel on cable TV, you look at the op-ed page of the New York Times. At this point in 2024, when it comes to domestic politics and policy, if you're talking about mainstream liberal media, there is some Black representation, right? Then
Yes.
when you turn to foreign policy, when they switch to the foreign policy segment, not just Israel, Palestine, anything, that all disappears, right?
Yes.
Why do you think that is? And what is the cost of that to America's public conversation about America's role in the world?
Yeah, there are a few people, Howard French has made a career
Yes,
like this. I
yes.
think Eugene Robinson back in the day before he became a columnist. There are a few of us, but I think the natural portion of this is as follows. We were all very deeply concerned about our ability to represent ourselves and our ability to have a voice in the conversation around race and racism in this country. And so that was like the area that was prioritized. But I think getting that worldliness, is just different, just on a basic class level. Given the type of environments that most African Americans come from, we tend to not be the most traveled people. We just haven't, we just don't know the world. And I will say, well within my lifetime as an adult and as a working journalist, I was shocked to discover how Central America was. It's mind blowing, like to go out in the world and actually see it, it's like really, really mind blowing. And I think in our minds, we're off in our little ghettos, in our little corners, doing our little writing. And we don't realize how tied we are to this bigger thing. We know there's a world out there, but the extent to which we're tied, we don't quite understand it.
You're a deep student of history, and I wonder when you were thinking about this move towards writing about the world outside the United States, but bringing your experience and your lens that you have as a student of Black history and as Black American, if there were precedents that you thought of. I mean, what I immediately thought of when I heard you were writing this book was King's speech on Vietnam. But
Right.
also there's Du Bois, right? Or Paul Robeson, people who brought a larger critique of the Cold War about American imperialism while connected to a view on race. I'm wondering, were there precedents that you thought about when you thought about now extending your writing more abroad and especially on Palestine and Israel?
Yes and no. Yes, from an inspiration level, you know what I mean? Like, weirdly enough, what I thought back to is the long history of Black journalists in this country and how it was never a safe occupation. That Ida B. Wells was never safe. Walter White is going into the South, passing as a white man to investigate lynchings. He could have been killed at any moment. I thought about that a lot, but the no part of it is, I think, what makes it difficult. Like you, I am a product of what you might call, I don't know, literary journalism, new journalism, or whatever, like that particular craft that, is practiced at the New Republic, New Yorker, Atlantic. I come out of that world. And on a craft level, I love the thing. You know what I mean? I love long form as a thing because that is a way of thinking too. That's a way of analyzing the world. You know what I mean? Where you pull a little bit from the world of literature, you pull a little bit from the world of books, you pull a little bit from the world of reporting to create, this thing. And I love that as a method, but the politics of that world are so bad on this. And part of this is in that essay. there are precious few Black people who have had the space to pursue that, and even fewer who've had the space to pursue it internationally. And so that part was very lonely and very, very isolating. There are people who I learned from, people who I admire as craftspeople who are so distant from my politics on this. And that, a lot of that essay is me working through that.
Yeah. One of the things that I wonder if you've thought about is there's a whole class of people, including many of the people at those kind of magazines that you mentioned that you and I worked at, that are willing to hear you say that America is a racist country, but they're not willing to hear you say Israel is a racist country. And America is our country. How do you explain the fact that, at least in those circles, you can say harsher things about the United States and oppression in terms of the United States than you can about a country where people aren't even living?
So I would say two things. There's this great book called Our American Israel by this woman, Amy Kaplan, who regrettably passed away from brain cancer. But it looks at the cultural, I guess, similarities between the two countries, how culture influenced it. And she points out that the story that America tells itself is a story that rhymes with the story Israel tells itself. This gets very dark in certain places, by the way, which we can talk about later. But as to your question, I think it's a couple of things. I think the fact that what you cite, the ability to say that was a fight. That was not always true. You know what I mean? That is not a natural development. That was a fight that was every bit as vicious as the fight that's happening right now on behalf of Palestinians, empowering them to tell their own story and opening up the perspectives. It was like this. I mean, I was watching a documentary on the Kerner Report a couple of nights ago. They had news footage, and every single television journalist that they put, they were all white, all of them. And so what I stand on is the shoulders of a very, very long fight to get to this position where you could be on the cover of the Atlantic and make the case for reparations, right? That was not true 10 years before that. That was not true 20 years before that. And so I think we are just at the beginning of what I hope will be a successful struggle and a successful fight to change that and to open, some things up. I think that's the first thing. But Peter, I think there's something deeper too. It is immensely troubling. And I wanted to sit in this tension and in this trouble to accept that a group of people can suffer from existential collective punishment, that can suffer from industrialized genocide, which itself is the climax of centuries of oppression, of pogroms, ethnic cleansing, mass murder, other genocidal violence, etc. And say that legacy is now attached to a state that is pursuing similar violence against another group of people. That's not just dark because the state is Jewish. It forces us to face some things about ourselves and maybe even some of the underlying linchpins and pillars of progressivism and the left. Like this idea that somehow like the oppressed are ennobled or oppression is ennobling, that there can be this broad alliance of oppressed people. There's something dark here that is beyond Israel itself that I think is really, really hard to face.
Yes. And one of the things that I found most intriguing about the book and that some of the statements I've heard you made is that you seem particularly interested in what Black Americans should learn from this, from the way that the dominant political story that Jews ended up taking collectively from the Holocaust was we need our own state, a state based on supremacy. And I was thinking, what is the danger that Ta-Nehisi is thinking about? Is he talking about Liberia? Could it connect to Black Panther and Wakanda as a vision? And then I heard you say this thing in the Ben Rhodes interview, which was very powerful, where you basically said about Kamala Harris and the Democrats, you said it was a very Black convention. And so in some sense, these are Black bombs. Talk to me about this universal warning, but particularly the one that you're relating to Black Americans here.
Yeah, so in the case of Israel, I would say, and I have never said this out loud really, but it's something that I've been marinating on, so I don't quite have this down. But I really think it's important to understand that this idea of a state as safety was rooted in a European, very, in fact, German romantic idea that states somehow verified peoples, that this was tied to land, that this was tied to language, that this was tied to culture. And those were particular things for particular people. Again, that's not a Zionist idea.
The age of nationalism. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, in fact, Nazism is very tied to that idea, for instance. And so what I saw the thinkers of that age doing was saying, okay, we are oppressed, not necessarily questioning the premises or the frame of the era, but actually accepting them and saying, we need to go and do X, Y, and Z, and that will be our liberation. Again, I'm at pains to say this. That is not a Jewish era. You actually see it across African American history also. Sometimes we question the frame, but sometimes we accept it and say, we just need to do X, Y, and Z. And we don't ask deep questions about the models that we're actually doing. And so to fast forward that into today, I'm out at the DNC. And again, it's a very Black convention, Blackest convention I've ever seen. I was in this group chat and a guy made the joke and he said, this convention is so Black that the first white person to talk was Steve Kerr, basketball coach. And you're seeing all this, and the models are Jesse Jackson's running 84 and 88, and the models are, Fannie Lou Hamer and Shirley Chisholm, and they're Native Americans there, who are making their cars, and, the Latinos are there. That was very inclusive, which has always been at the core of the best of the Black struggle, that this is not just us, this is all of us, except it's not all of us, and I look outside and I see a group of people who can't even speak on the floor, can't even make a speech, can't even be allowed to talk. And this is at a convention to nominate a Black woman who bears all of that legacy. That's dangerous. That's dangerous. Because it means that, did we really learn the lesson of Fannie Lou Hamer? Or was the lesson just that slavery is not wrong, being the slave is what's wrong? And that is a dark prospect. That's a dark prospect. And when I was in Israel, on the West Bank, the saddest thing for me was that the Israeli state project does not question the frame, that it accepts the frame. And I guess for us to just accept the frame that Joe Biden has presented to us, that the Democratic Party has presented us, that the last, umpteenth years and decades of politics have presented to us on Israel and towards Palestinian would be a grievous mistake. And in fact, a hijacking and a betrayal of the legacy that brought us here in the first place.
I'm curious whether you have had pushback from Black Americans on this question, because I would say, I, like many Jews, have spent my entire life having this argument. I had it with my grandmother. I had it my whole life. And people like to kind of critify this story about Israel being a liberal democracy. But as you rightly intuited, at the end of the day, the hard kernel of the argument is man is a wolf to man. And we are not going to be the people to take the risk on a fundamentally different world. Arthur Hertzberg, before he died, once said to me that he had been in a debate with Edward Said, and Said said, why would Jews want a state after all the brutality of states? Jews were so creative in diaspora. And Hertzberg said, yes, these states, they're terrible, they're brutal, we'll give ours up fifth, So when you make this argument and someone says to you, wait a second, you want Kamala Harris to endanger her chance of being the first Black woman president on a basis of principle for Palestinians, given how precarious the situation for Black, and with Donald Trump there, do you get that pushback?
Weirdly, no. But I think the difference is that the imaginative impulse has always been there, right? This idea that it was always supposed to be bigger than you is intrinsic in the struggle. Look, we started the tour at the Apollo Theater right in the heart of Harlem with Ayman Mohyeldin. You can't get any more in the center of the Black community than right there. And people were very, very happy to have that conversation. I also think there is a sense that we already did the symbolic thing. We did that. We gave Obama all of the room and et cetera. And so I don't think I am the only one who thinks this one has to mean something more than symbols if it's going to be real. It does not mean that you don't vote for Kamala. And I think people are clear on that. Black people come up to me in the street and thank me for talking about this. I have not had the Black person come up to me yet to say, you're endangering this. Maybe if I was more resentful, personally, of Kamala, which I'm not. I watched the debate like everybody else and was very happy to see her take apart Donald Trump. I was gratified like everybody else. And you can feel that, you know what I mean? And at the same time, this has to stand for something. I feel like I'm pulling from a very real tradition. So it's not just really me talking when I say this.
Yeah. Just because you mentioned Obama, I can't help but ask it. You were obviously known for having conversations with him. Do you think if he was reading your book, The Palestine-Israel Sucking, he'd say, yeah, I knew all that, but he just couldn't do anything about it?
I know people who were close to him at a different point in his life. They say he knows. They say it's impossible for him to be at the University of Chicago and not know, to have gone to Columbia and not known, given what those environments are. Chicago is home to the largest Palestinian diaspora in the country. It's actually hard to not
Mhm.
know. I haven't talked to him. I wish I had known more at the time that I was in conversation and done those interviews. I certainly would have pressed more. Looking back on his presidency, he kind of acted like somebody who knew, but maybe, and now I'm getting into speculation, also felt that there was little he could actually do. Someone once told me, who, as I said, knew him at a different point in life, not only did he know, but Bibi knew that he knew.
Yes,
Bibi hated
yes.
him for it.
I think that's exactly right. And I think there were a lot of people in the organized American Jewish community and the Israeli government who suspected he knew or thought because he's black, he's likely to know. And that makes
Right.
him dangerous.
Is that your sense of him?
My sense of him was that the story he told was about his connection to progressive and liberal Jews. He said he read David Grossman's book, Yellow Wind. He talked about his relationship with Arnold Jacob Wolff, who was progressive. And he talked about himself being a liberal Jew and all this thing. And I'm sure there's some truth to that, but I also wonder whether that was an easier thing for him to say politically than to say, I actually also feel sometimes like a Palestinian, or I identify with, like, that would have been impossible. And so he could say this thing, which was to say, I'm with these group of Jews, not with these group of Jews, but he couldn't say, I really identify with the Palestinians. And Kamala, do you have any sense of whether she knows?
I have heard from several people that they have had private conversations with her that indicate some sympathy, that indicates a position that is different than Biden. Now, what that will mean and how that will be manifested, I don't know. I will be honest with you. I mean, this is probably the closest I've ever been to any sort of activism, in the sense that I feel that I have a certain position in American life and can yell things. What effect that has, I don't know, but I have a responsibility to yell and to point out the grievous problem and the great damage of being the first Black woman president and having 2,000-pound bombs with your name on them dropping on Gaza. That's a nightmare. Like, we think about voting and politics in a very just get past this one kind of way, like a very practical, tangible way. But I do think, should Kamala win this year and 2028 comes around, I think the moral problem will become a practical problem if nothing changes. Like, at that point, like, say we're in 2028, right? Okay, so this is 20 years of this election is the most important election in our lifetime. Okay, so now I have to look at the content of those elections. And effectively, what you are telling me is the price of protecting a woman's right to choose is support for apartheid and genocide. Like, that is the rough math of what you are saying to me. There are women in Palestine, too.
It's like the cost of the New Deal was sustaining Jim Crow.
That's right. That's right. That's what it'll be. So now, like, we're not questioning systems anymore. We just need power. That's all we're saying. The systems are no longer the problem. And that's, at that point, I wonder where I will be and who I will be as a political person, because that would be deeply problematic for me.
So because the book is so interested in this question of why victimization doesn't necessarily ennoble, it requires you to tell a story, and that there are various stories, and some of those stories are very, very dark. I was wondering whether you thought about that vis-a-vis Palestinians who are in the midst of it now, of this unimaginable slaughter. Is it fair to have that question about Palestinians now, about how Palestinians narrate their own excruciating ongoing dismemberment? Because one could say that Hamas, which has something of an Islamist supremacist vision, is its own dark version of that story, right? In that it's not really within an equality framework, the story that it's telling about what's happened to Palestinians. Or is it not fair to ask that of people while they're going through it, and you ask that question after it's stopped?
You know what? Not only do I think it's fair, I think if Palestinians weren't pushed out of the frame, you would see that conversation. I think they would have it. Because I've had it privately with many of the people that influenced this book. I mean, they are not unthinking people. I take them to be human beings like any other thinking group of intelligent human beings with differences and thoughts and visions and ideas, but there's no room. Like, you can't name a Palestinian bureau chief. There's just no room. You know what I mean? Part of sucking the oxygen out and keeping them out is like that kind of nuance that you just got at. There's just no room for it. You know what I mean? Because then you're lucky if you get, like one Palestinian in discussion. And then they have to speak to the whole of it, right? Which is an impossible position to be in. Like, entry is, will you denounce Hamas? You know what I mean? Like, maybe if you had 3 or 4 up there, the conversation would be different and you would get something a little bit more textured and nuanced.
Some of your writing that I have found most powerful has been involved in dissecting arguments made to defend power. I'm thinking of particularly like the first white president. You go through George Packer, Nick Kristof, Bernie Sanders, right? And you basically dismantle the claims that they're making about Trump's ascendancy not being about racism and white supremacy. You have done a lot of that, but you decided not to do that same project when it came to the kind of exoneration of Israel or of Israeli Jews. A lot of people have come at you a little bit on this question of why you didn't engage with the pro-Israel arguments.
So I would say two things. I would say it actually is there. I would say like that's the point of Jabotinsky. That's the point of Herzl. That's the point of Benny Morris. That's the point of Moses Hess. You know what I mean? It is there. But I'm dealing with a group of people who don't have the microphone. It's very different. You know, like I'm living in a world where the Black Panther is a movie. You know what I mean? Like you can't imagine an analog for Palestinians at all. And so I guess in some ways my work was kind of a corrective because I probably centered their frame a little more than maybe I felt like I had to. But I think if I took that critique at its highest, what it says is I did not go and interview settlers, for instance, which I didn't do. Maybe I would have done if that was the entirety of the book. Maybe I would have done that. But the urgent thing for me felt that I wrote the case for reparations. And in using reparations from West Germany to the state of Israel, I felt that I had erased the people. That essay is about correcting that. And I guess I would just say over and over again, the Zionist argument is not hard to access. It's everywhere. You know, it is the air around us. And I guess the last thing I'll say about that is how often do we ask the question of authors who are sympathetic to Israel? How often do we say, hey, how many Palestinians have you interviewed? How often do we interrogate the very structures? Who is looking at our magazines and our newspapers to say, how many Palestinian authors are you publishing? Like, where are Palestinians in this narrative? And so I find it interesting that I am being subject to a level of critique, which I will happily answer for, but a critique that is not actually made of the structures that actually have the most power.
Right. I've heard a lot of people say, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates only spent 10 days in the West Bank. And my response to people has been, okay, I know you've been to Israel 25 times, and I know which hotels you've stayed at in Tel Aviv. But I bet those 10 days he spent in the West Bank is significantly more than the number of days that you spent with Palestinians in the West Bank. You've been going there since you were 13. So it's all about what you see when you're there, as opposed to the number of days that you're there. Yeah. You are known for not being an optimist about the course of history. And the book, in some ways, is about the way in which violence begets violence, victimization begets victimization. You're a student of the Civil War, which was not a nonviolent end to slavery. I know you've thought a lot about the Haitian Revolution, which was not a nonviolent end to oppression. We do have the example of the civil rights movement or South Africa. Help me think about how you think about potentially different models. And is it possible to avoid that tragedy in which all of this violence that is heaped upon Palestinians just ends in a bloodbath for everybody? I mean, we're in the midst of it now, but in which it just basically engulfs all the people between the river and the sea.
So I'll say the dark part of this first. Even our nonviolent revolutions have the specter of violence behind them. I don't know that you can divorce the civil rights movement from World War II. I don't know that you can divorce South Africa and apartheid from the end of the Cold War.
Absolutely.
Like I think that's, you know, even if the revolutionaries themselves are not violent, the specter of it is really always there. Having said that, there is something that is very, very powerful in this struggle that is at hand. And that is that the truth is blatantly obvious and the lie is critically important to the project. You know, there are a lot of people who say, well, Americans don't want to know. I'm not sure that's true because there's a ton of energy put into the project of them not knowing. Like there was a lot of effort. You know what I mean? And so I always have to ask, well, if that were true, why is so much effort put into crafting a narrative? I actually am of the mind that it is very hard for human beings to perpetrate horrific violence on other human beings with their eyes wide open. You know, and that's one of the theories in the book. Like, I actually think that's actually hard to do. So I think knowing does matter. And the telling of what it is not hard. Like what is happening on the West Bank, the fact that Israel is not a democracy, you can explain this in about 2 sentences. And then that was like the biggest surprise. People said it was complex, and that's what I thought. I thought I was going to go over and see some really morally complex, but I didn't. I mean, it was so obviously immoral. It is blatantly immoral. And I think the argument that it's not is extremely hard to make. And the shadow of that to me is that when you make it, people don't say this is not happening. They say, yes, but what did they do to deserve it? That is effectively the counter argument.
Yes, that Israel had no choice.
Right. Israel had no choice but to perpetrate apartheid.
Right. So this most famously came up in that CBS interview where it's basically like, why aren't you acknowledging all the ways in which the Palestinians brought this on themselves, or in which Israel had no choice but to do all of that?
Why leave out that Israel is surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it? Why leave out that Israel deals with terror groups that want to eliminate it? Why not detail anything of the first and the second intifada, the cafe bombings, the bus bombings, the little kids blown to bits? And is it because you just don't believe that Israel, in any condition, has a right to exist?
And I'm curious, you have made a very conscious decision in these interviews to basically say, I'm not going to engage with that set of questions. I'm not going to talk about why there were suicide bombings or what Iran wants to do. I'm basically going to just say none of it justifies this from my perspective. Help me understand the decision to respond in that way.
There's always good reasons to perpetrate a system of apartheid, of segregation, of plunder, or whatever. There are always good arguments, always. Always. I suspect that if you read the documents justifying apartheid, the argument was not, we are evil and we want to perpetrate apartheid. I know
a lot of them were very similar to the arguments we hear now.
Yes.
You know, Africa's a tough neighborhood. How many times?
Right.
You know?
And hey, it was. They do hate you. And it's true for Black Americans too. There were arguments in favor. Like I was telling somebody this the other day. They said, well, we think the slavery, anti-slavery debate was not complex. It was. And from their perspective, it was. There was an entire cast of what they call pro-slavery intellectuals who made the case for why you needed slavery, why it was, as Calhoun called, a positive good. They believed that an underpinning of democracy in a free country required a kind of elevation to which people of African descent had not attained.
Right. John Calhoun was not a dumb guy. Right?
No, these are not dumb people. You know what I mean? Like, so this was a very real argument. Segregation, you know what I mean? Within the lifetime of my parents, the argument was integration is dangerous. Look at the crime rates in these Black neighborhoods. And the crime rates were high. They were. And I think what most people will say is none of that justified the upholding of an immoral system, period. And so if that is the argument, then why am I talking about suicide bombers? Why am I talking about the violence of Palestinians? Either this is right or wrong, period. If you want to make the argument, I need to inflict apartheid and a violent system of segregation on this group of people because I am endangered, you should honestly and forthrightly make that argument. Right. I disagree with it because my moral underpinnings are different.
Yeah. No, this is one of the things that gets me about the Jewish community in some ways the most deeply is I encounter and listen to so many brilliant people. I listen to them talk about Talmud, Jewish texts, and I think there's so much brilliance and talent, and I'm so awed and dazzled. And then they switch to this issue, and it reminds me, all of their brilliance is not getting us anywhere, because when it comes to this, as you say, it's a simple moral question. We have a couple questions from the audience, one of which is about, Black nationalism really well. I know it was even part of your upbringing. And I wonder if you can talk about the ways in which Black nationalism and Zionism are similar and the ways in which they're different.
Well, in fact, it's a long history of many Black nationalists actually being Zionists themselves, and having great admiration for Zionism. And I think what the impulse is you have a group of people suffering from, as I said, centuries of horrific oppression. And you see them go and build a nation of their own. I mean, this is what it looks like, a nation of their own where they can feel safe and they can feel good about themselves and they can feel worthwhile. And certainly from the outside, there's a kind of affinity. But actually, the impulse is older. It goes back to where we started this conversation and that root in romantic nationalism, because there's a whole series of 19th century Black nationalists who look to Africa in much the same way, who very much believe that a state should be crafted in Africa. Liberia obviously being the example of a state that comes out of that. But the dialogue about Africans from those Black American Black nationalists was very, very similar to the dialogue that Zionists had about Palestinians to the extent that they saw them, which is to say that we will go there and we will be a kind of fortress of civilization in darkest Africa. It's very similar, very, very similar. The treatment, the degradation of Black people in Africa, of Native Africans themselves by Black Americans, very, very similar. And so that's the first thing. I don't want to overly simplify this because weirdly enough, there also is a strain of Black nationalism that is obviously very critical of Israel. Malcolm X, for instance, towards the end of his life, when he takes his travel and he actually goes to Gaza, and I haven't explored this enough to really know about this, but a lot of people point to Nasser as an influential figure and his attempt to craft a kind of Pan-African, Pan-Arab, however you want to put it, and the appeal that had to Black Americans. The thing is, the oldest Muslim communities in this country are Black communities. There were enslaved people who were literate in the Quran who were brought over here. And so Islam has a particular root and influence in the Black community that goes all the way back to Africa. And so I think that's part of it too, in terms of the complexity. But for me, what I saw and the thing that I really wanted to think about is this temptation to not question systems, to just accept the priors of even of the people that oppress you.
This question of Black nationalism, its different variations, you created a Black country in Africa. I mean, you adapted it, right? Wakanda in Black Panther. Did you think at all about Israel and Zionism?
I was more thinking about nationalism. But yeah, you can see it as a critique of the idea of nation states and the idea of ethno-states. Yes, that is in that work. But I probably was more gaming out what a real nationalism would be. I mean, in the fictive space, one of the things that you then have the ability to do is say, okay, so now I'm going to take all these questions of race off the table and look at you as actual people who are perpetrating a system. So yes, questions of nationalism were there. I did not know enough about Zionism at that point to kind of go that far.
You think it's possible that you might go back to fiction or comics or movies and take this subject into a different medium?
Probably. I hope so. I still enjoy that world. I mean, I had to, obviously come back and do this, but yeah, I could see that. Yes.
Since the book came out, is there one particular interaction about it with somebody in public or in private or a message or something that has really stuck with you?
Yes. The messages I have gotten from my Muslim friends, from my Arab friends, and my Palestinian friends. And what I have been told is they are very, very happy to see this perspective out in the world. And the second part of that message has always been because we can't do it. And that makes me really, really sad. And so, yes, that very much sticks with me.
You have this very powerful part of the book where you talk about being in the Chicago area in a group of Palestinian Americans, just Palestinian Americans, and the way they're talking to one another when there's nobody else around. And you compare it to the way Black Americans may talk when it's just them. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that's like to witness and what we should learn from that kind of intimate grammar that people have when they have the comfort to not feel like they're worried about the external glare.
I'm hesitating because I feel like I don't want to betray them. I mean this in the sense that these are people that don't really have a public voice. So I feel a little awkward about rendering their private conversation public because they don't have the opportunity to do it public. I will say that getting to see them think through October 7th, which they did, these are people who in their hearts are deeply committed to nonviolence. These are not Hamas is great, you know what I mean, sort of people. There was a woman there whose husband was born and raised in Gaza. She had been to Gaza. They were having a kind of conversation that you simply cannot have in public. Thoughts about this, thoughts about that. And it's sad that there just is not room. We lose because they can't talk in public.
Absolutely. Yeah, no. And I would just call out for people who don't follow it, the Makdisi podcast that Isam Makdisi. And every time I listen to that converse, I think, I don't necessarily agree with every single thing that people say on that podcast. I think if more of this showed up in the mainstream media, we would be having such a more sophisticated, smarter, more valuable conversation.
And so then our policies are affected by that, by the way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just because you mentioned October 7th, you have mentioned the parallel with Nat Turner. And I'd just like to hear you think about what is the right way and the wrong way for people to think about an analogy like that? Or for that matter, analogies with Native Americans who slaughtered indiscriminately white settlers in the United States in the 19th century. What is the value of that analogy and what are the dangers of that analogy?
So I think from my basic politics, I am not built in such a way that I can look at something like October 7th and not be horrified. I just can't. You know what I mean? Political arguments aside, I am telling you in my soul, in my bones, I don't have the constitution for that.
Right.
You know,
Right.
I just don't. Nat Turner, who took as, his cause and his ideology that everyone, all white people involved in the system of enslavement were guilty. Women, children, whatever. That children had to be killed because they were going to grow up to be enslaved. His analysis was not wrong. Like, the logic of it is not incorrect. In fact, the logic of Sinwar, like, there's an argument that the logic is not wrong, but the morality of it, again, I always struggle with Nat Turner. And I didn't have a vocabulary to explain why, but I always struggled with like that idea. And I think two things. First, like, if you take as your belief, which for instance animates my anti-death penalty stance, that, human life really is sacred. I heard this, I was on Democracy Now! And they were interviewing this young lady who's a student leader. And she had this motto, which she said, every life a universe.
Yes. Yes.
And I really believe that.
Tradition. Yeah.
I thought that was a wonderful way of saying it. So I would say that the minute you start looking coldly upon the lives of people who are entrenched in systems, I wonder what the vision of your liberation is. And I think it's really important to think like 5 steps ahead. Like, should you win, who are you going to be?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
Do I really want to live in a state run by you? Do I want to live, like, do I want to be part of a society in which you have power? I'm not sure I do. So, like, where are we going here? And I understand that's very, very difficult work for oppressed people to do.
Yeah.
But I think it's important. I think how you fight actually is important. I'm uncomfortable making those kinds of declarations because I really think the people that need to be hashing this out in public are not me. You know what I mean? The people that can speak to this in a direct kind of way are not me. But if you ask me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, how I feel, that's how I feel. Those are my politics.
Yeah. Well, Ta-Nehisi, the reason that I kept badgering you all those years was because I just had this sense that even though Palestinians were working heroically against incredible odds to change this conversation, and that there were a few of us lunatic, self-hating Jews who were trying to do something that we wouldn't be able to do it, and that we needed the cavalry, and that you are a big part of that cavalry.
Did you think I would actually go? Or did you think I'd never go?
I didn't know you well enough to know. And I just have to say, to me, what's so beautiful about it is I really believe that as much as being Jewish is at the center of my being and I care about my people, this is not a struggle of tribe against tribe. It has to be the opposite of that, right? And it has to be a movement like the great movements that bring together people from every possible background, bringing their own traditions of humanity to bear and their own experience. And that's what you did in the book. And I'm super, super grateful for it. And for this hour we got to talk.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.